Kolokotrones, The Klepht and the Warrior, 60 Years of Peril and Daring, an Autobiography, translated by Mrs. Edmonds, author of Greek Lays, Regas Pharios, etc. Preface by Monsieur Gennadius, Greek envoy to the court of St. James, London, 1892. Preface. The Greek text of the autobiography of which a talented and muse-inspired lady has given in the following pages an abridged English version may be considered as one of the most noteworthy contributions to modern Greek literature. It is remarkable as a specimen of the terse and graphic idiom which prevails with the illiterate portion of the Greek people. It is valuable as an historical, and it is characteristic both of the document, Hero, and of his amanuensis, who wrote it under his dictation. Kolokotronis gives, in his own narrative, a pretty faithful picture of himself, and to that picture some additional touches will be attempted later on. But a few words may here be prefixed with regard to Georgios Tertsetis, who actually wrote and published these memoirs. Tertsetis was a native of Zante, a man of much talent, of considerable culture, and gifted with a peculiar grace and sweetness of diction. He was a poet and an orator, and though himself possessed of a classical education, he was one of the most uncompromising and, as far as his own writings are concerned, one of the most successful apostles of the so-called demotic school in modern Greek literature. The school namely of those who aimed at preserving, in the written tongue, the spoken vernacular, unchanged and unimproved, and who were opposed to all progress or epuration. For many years Tertsetis was the librarian of the Greek Parliament, which under King Otto was still composed of 2 chambers, and in that capacity he came into close contact and intimate relations with all the great survivors of the War of Independence. On the 25th of March, 6th of April of each year, the anniversary of Greek independence, coinciding as it does with the festival of the Annunciation, was celebrated in the chamber by an oration which Tertsetis delivered, never failing to move his audience to enthusiasm and tears. It was on one of these occasions that he announced the forthcoming publication of the reminiscences of Kolokotronis, and related how he had succeeded in persuading the old warrior that he owed it to his country to leave a written record of his sufferings and of his deeds of valor in her cause. He had repeatedly begged him to do so, but Kolokotrones refused, pretexting his inability to write. He could read, in a fashion, but in the way of writing he could not do more than scratch his signature. At last one day, Tertsetis said to him, "General, you will remain like a musical instrument which brings forth sounds men listen to and enjoy, but which does not itself comprehend the value of its own voice. If you do not yourself record your deeds, they will hereafter appear as the play of chance, not as the works of your own wisdom and conscience. Deeds of heroism and acts of devotion are befitting a Greek, but they must be recorded in writing, as of old. You hesitate lest you should do injustice to others. Speak the truth as you know it to be. Be not concerned lest you fall into errors. You will not lead the world astray. Truth will herself appear foremost. And if your memory fail you as to details, who will put it down to you as a sin? You object you are illiterate. You know enough, and to spare. Speech is literature. Speak, and I will write. For there lived many a brave man before Agamemnon and Achilles, who, having chanced no chronicler, now lie forgotten, unpraised, and unmourned. Do not trust the record of your own deeds to others than yourself, but fear the adventurer in literature, as you have shunned him in other walks. He scrutinized me, Tertsetis goes on to say, with his glance, now wild, now soft and caressing, and then he said to me, "Come tomorrow, come early," he again cried out to me from the window as I was leaving. So the dictation began in the summer of 1836, and a part of these reminiscences was privately printed in 1846, 3 years after the death of Kolokotrones. The printing was continued in 1850, but the whole was not published till 1852. Tertsetis noted down these memoirs, not in shorthand, with which he was unacquainted, but by writing as fast as he could follow Kolokotronis, who did not precisely dictate, but narrated his tale as he usually talked. He was already bowed down more by the terrible hardships which he had endured than with years. Besides, his idiom and mode of expression was peculiar, and, as Tertsetis relates, often a gesture, the intonation of his voice, or the expression of his countenance indicated and explained more than his rugged sentences. The original manuscript must therefore have been of a very fragmentary description, and Tertsetis adds that he marked with dots many gaps which he had intended to request Kolokotrones to supplement, had he been spared to do so. The fidelity with which Tertsetis accomplished his self-imposed task cannot be disputed. On the contrary, the style used is only too faithful a representation of the idiom of Greek mountaineers of the times to which the narrative relates. It is an idiom as peculiar as the English of the Scottish Highlanders, with a large admixture of barbarisms, and with many abbreviations and the suppression of such explanatory words or sentences as may be suggested by the context, or may be easily understood by one conversant with the habits of thought and life of the speaker, but which compel the ordinary reader to halt and consider at every sentence. Moreover, Kolokotrones was addressing his remarks to one already familiar with the general course of the events of which he was offering rather his own version than a connected and systematic recital. For all these reasons, even to a Greek, the perusal and thorough comprehension of this remarkable book is no smooth reading. It requires, in any case, some acquaintance with the general outlines of the history of the Greek War of Independence. The courage, therefore, with which Mrs. Edmonds has undertaken to grapple with difficulties, in many cases hopeless, is as admirable as the apparent shortcomings and hiatuses of the English version are conceivable and almost inevitable. The narrative begins with the birth of Kolokotrones in 1770 and ends in 1836, when he was living peaceably at Athens. The first question which will present itself to one who has read it through is to what extent does it possess an historical value? Of its sincerity there can be no doubt. Kolokotrones dictated it when many of those concerned were still living. It was not addressed to the outer world, while in Greece itself everything relating to the War of Independence is eagerly scanned and jealously criticized. Nevertheless, while supplementary statements or rectifications of unimportant incidents may have been offered, no material contradiction has appeared with respect to Kolokotrones' narrative of his individual action in the war. It cannot, of course, be maintained that his narrative is absolutely impartial. He was an active participant in the events of that time. He was mixed up, however involuntarily, in the intestine troubles and strifes which considerably reduced and almost crushed the great object of the Greek uprising. But on the whole, his account of these events is dispassionate, fairly impartial, and singularly sober and unpretentious. In fact, Kolokotrones' countrymen esteem his deeds and the glorious part he took in the liberation of the country far higher than he himself appears to appraise them, and the verdict of history will confirm their appreciation. As regards their literary merit, these reminiscences can lay claim to no sort of artistic finish. There is no trace of scholarly ability or of careful composition. On the contrary, the style, as already stated, is rugged in the extreme, indicative not of the affected ruggedness of the professional philosopher, wearying and repellent in its too manifest effort, but of the unconcerned directness and unconscious force of a natural rhetoric. In one sense, we have here the modern counterpart to the narratives of Homer and Herodotus. All three relate the same tale, each in the particular manner of his age, the secular struggle between Greece and Asia. Kolokotronis, however, had this advantage over his predecessors in the narration of this ever-recurring strife, that before consigning to writing the deeds he relates, he engraved them on the page of history with the point of his sword. His story may well be said to have been written not with ink, but with the blood which flowed in torrents for the freedom of Greece. He was born and destined to this holy work. His family, which dates 3 centuries back, first appears in history as a living protest against foreign domination. They waged war against the Turk from their native crags and fastnesses, bequeathing from father to son the choice between blessing and curse, to continue or abandon the sacred tradition. Each succeeding generation is decimated in holocausts of martyrs, but it persists in the firm belief and inextinguishable hope of ultimate triumph. The abortive revolt of the Morea, in which his father, Constantine Kolokotrones, had taken a leading part, had just been suppressed when on April 3rd, the Easter Monday of 1770, Theodore was born under a tree on the hills of Rama in Messenia, where his clan had sought a refuge. The child of a struggle for freedom, he was reared up amidst the mountain songs of the Klephts and within echo of the wailings of the bondsmen of the plains. His father having been some years later seized and put to death by the Turks, he was sent by his mother, now an orphan of 12, to sell a load of wood in Tripolitza and bring back flour and salt. On his way thither he was waylaid and beaten by a Turk, the usual reminder to a Christian that he was but a Giaour and a slave. Kolokotrones managed to sell his firewood, but he brought back neither flour nor salt, but a sword, vowing vengeance to the tyrant. Who but his own stout heart would then have hoped that 40 years later, on the memorable 22nd September 1821, he was destined to enter Tripolitza as a conqueror? Yet he seemed marked out by Providence to work out such a revenge. His whole life was typical of the sufferings, the struggles, and the resurrection of Greece. The influence, the prestige of the name of the Kolokotrones was so dreaded by the Turks that the extirpation of the entire clan was ordered by the Porte in 1804. 36 of Theodore's brothers, cousins and relatives, and 150 of their followers were butchered in the struggle that ensued. But he remained undaunted, and after compelling the Turks to recognize him, at the age of 16, as chief of the armatolos of Megalopolis, he found himself again the object of a perfidious conspiracy intending to entrap him. He was thus forced to take refuge in Zante in 1805. Once in safety, his first care was to organize amongst the Greek refugees in the Ionian Islands a memorial addressed to the Emperor of Russia, entreating him to intervene in favor of Greece. No answer was received, but the Russian governor of the islands urged Kolokotrones to recruit a Greek corps for service against Bonaparte. "What wrong has Bonaparte done to us?" was the reply. "If you want men to fight for the freedom of Greece, I bind myself to muster a body of 10,000. For his inextinguishable hopes made him cling even from afar to his beloved mountains. And oft and again he would ascend with his young son the castle hill of Zante, and, pointing to the Morea, he would tell the boy that those were the fastnesses of their forefathers, which must again be free. The English occupation of the Ionian Islands opened up for Kolokotrones a new and brilliant prospect. With that far-sighted sagacity which guided all his resolves, he seized the opportunity to lend brilliant services to the British government during the siege of Santa Maura, and his bravery was rewarded with the grade of Major. It was then he acquired tactical knowledge and experienced the advantages of regular warfare. It was then he became acquainted with and conceived a devoted friendship for General Sir Richard Church. It was there, in the Ionian Islands, that Lord Guildford and General Church laid the first germ of English Philhellenism, the one by the revival of learning in Greece, the other by his resolute endeavours for the liberty of Greece. It was a long and dreary waiting, but at last the day, which 14 generations of Greeks had longed and prayed for, dawned with the spring of 1821, when the proclamation of Alexander Ypsilantis resounded throughout all Greece. "So when it reached my ears," said Kolokotrones, "when I heard the war trumpet of the fatherland calls you, I fancied that heaven and earth re-echoed the trumpet blast. I donned on my fez gallantly, I grasped the hilt of my sword with fervour, and I inscribed in my heart with letters of fire the immortal name of Alexander Ypsilantis." The long-expected hour had now arrived, and of the result he never doubted for an instant. "Fear not," he was wont to say, "God has pledged his word for the liberty of Greece, and he will not retract." He declared, "We have been baptized once with holy ointment. We shall again be baptized in blood for the freedom of the fatherland." The faith and piety of this rough and hardened warrior was that of an ascetic. In 1703, passing by a convent of the Virgin, ruined and devastated during the last revolt, he halted there and prayed fervently, making a vow to rebuild the shrine in its pristine grandeur, if but the Blessed Virgin inspired him how to free the country. The second year of the war, after his heroic successes, he returned to the sacred spot and fulfilled his vow. And again after his great victory at Valtetsi, it being a Friday, he ordered his troops to fast that day and offer up a thanksgiving prayer to God. But not these qualities alone endeared him to his men, over whom he exercised a magic influence. The prestige of his name, his ardent patriotism, his consummate knowledge of the country were powerful agencies in his favour. Above all, he was a born soldier and a great strategist. The troops which he led to battle were composed for the most part of raw recruits, badly armed and inferior, always in numbers and often in physique, to the splendid armies which the Turks poured into the Morea from Asia and Egypt. Yet he gained one victory after another, never a more glorious one than over the dreaded force of Dramali, whom he outwitted and outmanoeuvred. He was full of resource, especially in times of crisis and reverses. Memorable and most characteristic is the feat by which, pretending, in the midst of a precipitate retreat, to have suddenly routed the Turks, he set up a cry of exultation, and he deceived his own men, whom he thus rallied and actually converted from fugitives into pursuers. On another occasion, during the siege of Tripolitza, one of his officers drew his attention to a body of Turkish troops lurking in the distance. Kolokotrones looked around unconcerned, and replied that they were only birds of prey who must have just feasted on the body of Haji Kulele, a dreaded Turkish commander who had been killed, and they were now resting to digest him. In fact, he was the Odysseus of the Greek War of Independence, and he was befittingly named the Old Man of the Morea, Ogeron ton Morea, not on account of his age, which was not great at that date, but owing to his unrivalled experience, his unerring judgment, and his inexhaustible resource. In common with many great men, he was extremely superstitious, and like all good Klephts, an adept in divining by the bones of sheep. He believed in the portents of dreams, so much so that he often took military measures in accordance with the inferences he drew from his dreams. Yet he was full of dry humour, and many of his sayings remain fresh in the minds of men in Greece. It is related of him that when suffering from an abscess on the back, he asked his men how it looked. One told him it was no bigger than a pea, another that it was the size of a cherry, while a third assured him it was as large as an egg. "Strange," remarked Kolokotrones. "The distance is but from my head to my back, yet I cannot learn the truth." And again, when the Bavarian Regency committed the fatal blunder of condemning Kolokotrones to death on a trumped-up charge of treason, on the sentence being commuted to 20 years' imprisonment, the decree was read to him. "I shall cheat the regency," he said, "for I shall not live the 20 years." Being himself a humorist, he knew well how to frustrate attempts at scorn. At Tripolitza, on a Sunday, a lampoon directed against him was found nailed to the door of the church, where a large crowd soon gathered. Kolokotrones, going into Mass, took down the placard and put it in his pocket, but at the conclusion of the service he compelled the priest to read it aloud to the congregation, whom he then asked whether he had merited the insult. He was greeted with cheers and returned to his house amid an ovation. He was inexhaustible also in fables, by means of which he would convey much of his caustic and pregnant criticism, for he loved to examine the philosophical aspect of things, and he used to say that philosophy is observation. His rhetoric, rude and unadorned as it was, had great persuasive powers. His strategy would not have availed alone against Dramali's campaign. It was by haranguing his soldiers that he encouraged them to hold fast to their entrenchments and despise the onslaughts of the enemy. And when, after the establishment of peace and order, the rising generation were to be exhorted and urged to imitation of the deeds of their fathers, George Gennadius called upon Kolokotrones to address the young students of Athens. The scene was one never to be forgotten when, on the feast of the Assomati in 1838, the grisly old general stood up on the Pnyx and related to those who were now fortunate enough to be educated as free citizens by what sacrifices the fatherland had been redeemed and liberated. The voice of Greek liberty then re-echoed on those sacred rocks for the first time since the days of Demosthenes. The whole assembly was filled with enthusiasm and was moved to tears when he told them, in conclusion, that he had but one regret, that he had always prayed to fall sword in hand in battle, but he was now condemned to end his days on his couch. His own want of education made him even more eager that the rising generation should receive enlightenment. He often attended the lectures in the university and the gymnasia, sitting himself on the benches by the side of the scholars so as to excite pride in their studies. It was his wont to pace up and down the room while his son prepared his lessons, and on one occasion, stopping short, he asked him suddenly, "Kolinos, which do you take to be the great house of the nation?" "The king's palace," answered the boy. "No," said he, "it is the university." He had in him the innate love and admiration of the Greek for learning. He, however, knew well how to discern times and seasons. On the eve of the Revolution, while at Zante, he attended as usual the lectures of the master, Nicholas Kaliva, and being filled with enthusiasm at the mention of a free fatherland, he snatched the book from Kaliva's hands, and, tearing it up, "This you should now teach them," he said, "how to make cartridges with the paper." His whole mind and soul was indeed that of a soldier. His very appearance announced him as such. He was rather short in stature, of a thin, wiry frame, sunburnt and weather-beaten to a degree that he might well have been mistaken for a man of colour. He had a stentorian voice and an irresistibly piercing glance, to which his hooked nose lent the aspect of an eagle. And with the long hair, traditional to the Palikar, floating about him, he looked, as Pecchio says, like one of those splendid rocks which project from the Aegean. Dressed in the Greek fustanella, he wore during the whole of the war not a fez but a helmet, declaring that his mind was with the Greeks of old. And while, prior to the war, he served under British rule in the Ionian Islands, he would never consent to hang a tassel to the hilt of his sword, testifying thereby his strict obedience to the literal interpretation of Regis's immortal war song. Though hardened by a life of cruel wrongs by the terrors of slavery, in the midst of which he saw the light of day, by the untold horrors of a barbarous war of rapine and extermination, yet he had a childlike meekness and tenderness of heart. So that when the death of Karaiskakis was announced to him, he wept and wailed long and bitterly, repeating himself the dirges said to the brave slain in battle. He was of a truly Spartan simplicity, and in fact he took pride in the extreme poverty in which, in spite of his 100 victories, he had lived, and in which he was destined to end his days. He gloried in his achievements, and the liberation of Greece was his recompense. Speaking in the assembly at Nauplia in 1832, he said, "As commander-in-chief of the Peloponnesus, I have led many thousands of men, I have conducted many campaigns and have fought many battles, but I confess in all conscience that during the whole duration of the struggle I did not spend a single obole of my own, for I had none. The people fed me and supplied my troops with all they required. My sword supplied the rest, for all the horses and arms we needed we took from the Turks." With his small savings he at last built himself a house in Athens, and there he retired to pass the last days of his life in a room, about the only furniture of which consisted in the couch on which he lay. To those who called to pay their respects, "You see this room," he said. "It has no ornaments, the walls are bare, the windows ungarnished. Such is Greece as we have entrusted her to you of the younger generation." In 1821 we cleared the ground, we brought together the stones and the mortar, we built the walls and covered them in with a roof. It is for you now to deck the naked walls, to bring in the furniture, to hang the mirrors and light the lamps. This your advancement and enlightenment will do, and the blessings of your fellow men will earn for you a place of rest in the abodes of the just. He appeared to have felt his own end approach, and daily he took leave of his friends and compeers, bidding them pardon him that he might depart in peace. He was reconciled with his old comrade, Peter Mavromichalis, and he actually sailed to Hydra and Spetsai to make his peace with the aged Lazarus Kountouriotis, his old opponent, with Mexis and others. On the very eve of his death, which occurred on the morning of February 4th, 1843, he was present at the court ball, and there bid King Otto farewell. For such, indeed, was the heroic generation of the men who fought for the freedom of Greece. Nowhere on earth, and at no time in history, was the issue between wrong and justice, darkness and light, tyranny and freedom placed before the world more clearly than when, in 1821, the Greeks rose up against their oppressors in a struggle all but hopeless. Not alone the power of the great Turkish Empire was still unbroken and dreaded, but the cabinets of Europe were, one and all, opposed to the liberation of Greece at that time. Yet they braved all, and with their trust in God, with unshaken faith in the justice of their cause, a whole people marched to what then appeared certain destruction. At Messalonki, when they issued forth amid the drizzle of the night, feeling their desolation and their doom, they said to one another, "And the Almighty himself weeps for us tonight." But they went on, sword in hand, to fall for their country, greeting her with the gladsome cry, "Arise, thou dearest mother." And as they fell, they saw around them the old heroes of Greece, arrayed in their panoplies, bathed in the light of their immortal glory, rise up from their tombs to receive into their ranks those who had died to make the name of Greece live once more. J. G. London, October 1891.